Our story begins inside the clone barracks on Christophsis. Only a few months have passed since the beginning of the Clone War, a war that started on Geonosis and one that claimed thousands of clone lives. Clone Trooper Slick was sitting with his hands in his face. His blood boiled. The clones, his brothers, were nothing more than slaves for the oppressive group of lightsaber-wielding maniacs called Jedi. Slick was at Geonosis. He remembered never being prepared for all the screaming or the blood. All of their simulations on Kamino prepared them for war, but they never prepared them for combat like what they saw. The mental turmoil of their war. But it wasn't just their war to begin with. The Republic sent the clones in to save the Jedi from their own futile mistake. They ran into Separatist territory. They started the war. The Jedi were naive at worst, incapable at best, and that resulted in casualties. As the war had gone on, Slick watched his men vow loyalty to their general, Anakin Skywalker, a temperamental Jedi, one trying to be a hero all the time. Slick was furious. He slapped his hand against his bed and stood up with fire in his eyes. He walked into the washroom and dropped his hands heavily on the sink and faced the mirror. When Slick looked into his eyes, he could see the lives of his best friends and brothers, all of which he lost at each of the previous encounters. Battles that never needed to happen, and battles that took the lives of people who never deserved to lose them. Slick understood that from his point of view, the Jedi were evil, but he was also able to realize that without the war, his brethren would never be created. That did leave more to be desired, though. A 10-year-old clone, one who was mentally and physically 20, was alive because of a war a Jedi predicted? That didn't sound like something feasible. That also didn't sound like something or someone that could be trusted. Slick could be grateful for life, but was this even living? His brothers, his family, were suffering at the hands of the Jedi warmongers and a Senate who didn't even consider them sentient beings. They were a subhuman army, driven from their rainy world and their scientific platforms to serve in the Grand Army of the Republic. It sure sounded grand, didn't it? Maybe Slick was being too hard on Kenobi and Skywalker. They were both decent men, but these were indecent times. It's hard to respect someone who had never had proper war training, undertaking the role of leadership in said war. People died as a result of actions taken by these two Jedi. Men died because two people served a power-obsessed order that sat peacefully on Coruscant. Slick, himself, hadn't ever seen Coruscant before, but the Jedi and their political favoritism within the Republic gave them the power to be gods in a war of pawns. Slick threw his hands into his face and wanted to scream. All of this was coming from his perspective. He was seeing things through his own lens, and he was upset. How could this be remotely fair to anyone, especially the clones? But he even thought about the civilians of Christophsis. They didn't deserve this war. Their Crystal City was under siege for what reason? This war made no sense, and faced with the excruciating burden of consciousness, Slick had to question the entire morality of his own existence, one forced to happen because of the Jedi. On one side, he should be grateful for life, but that wasn't even life to begin with. Slick and the rest of his brothers had to get 35 years of life before their accelerated aging turned them into barely functioning elders. But that was even if they had a life to use for their own. They, as clones, didn't get a chance to go out and serve themselves. Their entire purpose was to fight. So even if they did get a solid 35 years of living, it was interrupted by 10 years of strict and tenacious training. If they survived this war, which would go on for who knows how long, what life did they get? They'd be left with the burden and the trauma of watching podmates die. Slick knew that feeling. All the men he grew up with died during the first battle of Geonosis. He was standing side by side with them when they were gunned down by Separatist battle droids. He remembered ducking for cover and trying to pull one of them out of dodge. His brother Blitz was injured. Instead of Slick being killed, it was Blitz who got to his feet using all of his strength and blocking a blast from killing Slick. If he survived this war, he'd be left with that. He would be reminded of that trauma every day like he had been every day since Geonosis. There was no normal life for the clones. With or without the war, they were nothing more than servants created for the purpose of dying. Slick clenched his fists and turned around. This was finished. He would not continue to do this, to serve these monsters. They had betrayed his brethren. While Slick's first thoughts were punishing the Jedi by detonating the artillery yards outside the barracks or even sending Republic battle tactics to the Separatists, he couldn't do that. If Slick went ahead with something like that, then he would only endanger the lives of his brothers. That was something he could not do, because it would make him no better than the Jedi who enslaved his brothers. So there had to be something. Maybe it was an uprising. At the very least, he had to try. As a clone sergeant, he had the command and the status to try and convince others to join. But not here. Rex and Cody were far too brainwashed. He couldn't afford to try and bring men to his side while being around them. Rex and Cody had good relationships with their Jedi generals. So what was his way out of this? Even Slick could have meant he was being harsh on Skywalker, but he was angry. He wanted something better, and Anakin still happened to be a part of the problem. Maybe not in control of it, but certainly not resolving it. Slick didn't want to keep fighting, but as it turned out, he would need to. With the Separatists bringing more reinforcements to Christophsis, and Slick not destroying the heavy tanks the Republic needed, the fight for the planet would be rather triumphant. Of course, something else that annoyed Slick, and made his blood boil more, was seeing the Jedi send another child to the front lines. Ahsoka was 14, barely older than the rest of the clones. But the biggest difference was, at least comparatively, the clones had accelerated aging, so they were at least adults in the war zone. But not Ahsoka. It was wrong. Slick's frustrations would follow him from the Battle of Christophsis to the Battle of Tath. He would survive both encounters, luckily, but many of his brothers would not. As a result, Slick offered himself up to return to Kamino to recruit the next leg of troopers for their fighting force. Being that Rex and Anakin had no reason to distrust him, they sent Sergeant Slick to Kamino. He'd be able to test out clones and determine which were fit enough for this growing legion. Skywalker was getting command over more troopers because, as the war had started to prolong, it became very apparent that he was one of the most successful generals in the entire war. So an upgraded fleet with 3 Venators, and more men were coming his way. Rex was actually very appreciative for Slick's enthusiasm, being that Slick seemed very uninterested lately. But this show of initiative was proof that their sergeant was a good soldier. It was time for Rex to familiarize himself with the new commander as it was, and assist General Skywalker with their training. It would be during this break where Slick would once again miss out on his chance to see Coruscant. By the time he reached Kamino, he had the proper time to prepare what he wanted. His fury had done him well on the battlefield, and his patience had assisted him with getting to a place of mental fortitude. He could help his brothers, and he had a way to do it, but Slick needed a clone commander to help him. Unluckily, aside from Shinies, there was no new clone commanders on Kamino. Well, as it turned out, one of the men of another clone unit was going to Kamino for some extra training. CC 1138 of the 21st Nova Corps was here for some additional training. Both Generals Skywalker and Mundi were away from the campaign, and Clone Commander Bacara was back at home for an extra training exercise. Bacara was a bit of a lunatic, but he was returning home so we could take ARC Trooper Alpha 17's ARC Trooper training program that he made available to every clone trooper who wanted to take it. Slick had no clue that something like that was going on at the moment, but truthfully, he was very pleased that he was here at the same time as another frontline clone commander. Slick and Bacara didn't see each other for the first day. Bacara was not even looking for Slick because he didn't know he was here or that he even existed. But after a long training session with the ARC Trooper program, Bacara walked into the mess hall. It was inside here where he came across Clone Trooper Slick. Bacara, unlike most of his brothers in the early war, didn't maintain a clean facial look. It wasn't exactly required, but it was frowned upon by the clones if one didn't keep up their looks. Well, he didn't care, and his men kind of embraced the barbaric approach their commander had. Regardless, Slick saw Bacara from a mile away, with his beard and flowing hair, so he approached the clone commander. As CC 1138 sat down, he looked at the food. Couldn't get much better than this. After all, Kamino delicacies were some of the best in the galaxy. Not really, but it was home-cooked food, and nothing beats food from home. Bacara started to eat when Slick interrupted him and asked if he could sit. The clone commander nodded his head. Slick sat down and placed his tray on the table, and swung his legs over the bench. He asked Bacara what he was doing back, and it was explained. The commander could tell that Slick wasn't a Shining, so he was curious as to why he was probing him for answers. It's a little weird, but he let Slick ask his common questions before drifting around to the reason he was actually here. Many clones knew that Mundi and Bacara were on decent terms, but they often reflected attributes about the other. They were both cold and calculated a lot of the time, and this did even come between the two of them. They were tolerable to the other, and Bacara was fine with this dynamic. They weren't there to be buddies that went to the bar. They existed for the sole purpose of winning this war. Afterwards, Mundi could go do his thing, and Bacara and the clones would do theirs. Slick posed a question, though, one that called into question everything Bacara knew about himself at this point. It was existential in nature, and it was created to be that way. There was no need for the clones to be slaves in this war, and that's exactly what Slick told his brother. They didn't have to be like each other, but Slick had a lot of things to say about the Jedi and their enslavement of the clone army since the beginning of the Clone War. Bacara didn't care that Slick was talking because it gave him ample time to eat his food while Slick's got cold. The clone sergeant from the 501st didn't care about food. He wasn't hungry because He couldn't waste a second of time on something that didn't matter. Despite Bacara not really taking this entire conversation with legitimacy, he did actually hear a couple points that Slick made, and he honestly kind of agreed. Being around Skywalker was night and day compared to being around Ki-Adi-Mundi. While Mundi did stand in the front lines with his men, unlike other Jedi around the galaxy, there was still a very big difference with personalities. Skywalker viewed the men differently, and it was through this difference that the two clones could reflect on how they should be truthfully viewed. And while Anakin was on one end of the spectrum, it wasn't the best scenario for the clones, so this left Bacara with one question: how does one rectify this issue? Slick didn't know, honestly, but he had an idea. He told Bacara of his theories on revolution or even an uprising. They wouldn't be able to get every clone to do it, but they could, with enough of an impact, convince the war to come to an end. Bacara shook his head. It would require too much of a rupture to the status quo. If they truly wanted to make a difference in the galaxy, then they needed to attempt something brash and bold, but something that many clones wouldn't have the gall to do. Slick listened as his brother told him that instead of a true revolution, they rebelled. Ironically, both words are pretty much the same, but Bacara wanted Slick to listen. They didn't need to rally a cause. If they wanted to save their brothers and themselves from this war, then there was realistically one way to accomplish this. Slick leaned in, and Bacara told him it was to take out the heads of the military. Bacara suggested starting with Jedi leadership. If killing them didn't solve the issue, then move on to Republic officers. Again, if that didn't work, then go above and beyond. Slick asked Bacara if he was suggesting that they become headhunters, and he nodded his head. They would pick their targets, kill them, and disappear. Slick liked this idea, but even with Bakara's ARC training from the day, they couldn't together do anything about this. Bacara smiled. He knew just the men that'd be willing to support such a movement. But he told Slick that this movement needed to remain quiet. He would get him a transmitter and prepare everything. With the rank of commander, there were more factors that Bacara could control, and he wanted to make sure he got them out of the way. Much of what would unfold after they left Kamino would change the future as they saw it, so he wanted to make sure they protected their brothers. He told Slick to trust him, and their hands came together in the middle of the table. They were brothers. They had to trust each other. This was their chance for complete and total freedom from the war they shouldn't have been fighting in. The two clones returned to their respective units in the coming days, and everything would remain silent. Slick was able to recruit a couple members of the 501st before reuniting with the main battle group. All of these new recruits were shinies, and they had fully put their trust in Slick instead of their future captain, commander, and general. For weeks, everything would go radio silent. Bacara wanted to make sure that what he did didn't affect the lives of others within the army. If the clones collectively were blamed for this, it could have inverse effects on those who didn't join their little rebellion. Then, there were news reports that headlined Republic news outlets. Jedi generals killed and rebellious clone strike. Commander Bacara finished the ARC Trooper program under Alpha 17 faster than anyone else who ever took it. Bacara then ran all of his troops through it, convincing them to break past the confines of their soldier thinking. He promised that it would yield better results on the battlefield, which was actually true. But because Bacara was able to expand the minds of his men, the Galactic Marines had their chance to really change everything around for themselves. The 21st Nova Corps was then given a chance to take their first step. For within the ARC Trooper training program that Bacara gave them, he also fed them theories that his new friend and compatriot Slick told him on Kamino. Bacara was pissed, and so were the men of the division. The only way to truly end this war was to remove the gods and generals. The first group of Jedi generals killed were all council members: Ki-Adi-Mundi, Eth Koth, and Mace Windu. This strike was very intentionally and strategically aimed at the Jedi Council, hoping that the deaths of these 3 Jedi would change the trajectory of the war. But it didn't. Instead of waiting around, the Nova Corps took their fleet and changed everything. They also gave Slick the signal, and he, along with the rest of his allies, abandoned the 501st and departed for Wild Space, where they met up with an entirely rebellious group of clones. When Slick arrived at the fleet, he was surprised to see that Commander Bacara had been recruiting. Among their ranks were the likes of Commander Neo, Alpha 17, and Omega Squad. Bacara welcomed in the hero of the movement. While Slick was never introduced to the others before disappearing in the Wild Space, Bacara championed his brother for opening their eyes. When Slick and his boys entered, it became clear to everyone what this movement was. They were guerrilla fighters, rogues, warriors, and everything in between. They were here to end the Clone War in any means necessary, to stop the enslavement of their brothers. This didn't mean that they would lose their chance for freedom in the post-war era, and everyone serving here knew that. They didn't plan on living in the new era of Republic once the war was finished. It had been decided before the death of the 3 Jedi that they would capture an outer rim world for themselves and live in it, doing as they did for their brothers, and freeing them from whatever oppression loomed over their heads. Regardless, those were pleasant thoughts for another time. They had one very important focus here. Their mission was to find targets, take down Jedi, and force them to end this war. The clone leaders of Bacara, Neo, Alpha, Slick, and Omega Squad were ready. They gathered together and they pulled up holomaps. Thanks again to the ranking that Bacara had, they were able to get access to important Republic documents, and because these troopers would never show themselves as sided with the Separatists, the Republic likely wouldn't change their stance. On the other side of the galaxy, as these warriors prepared for the next arrangement of strikes, the Republic was completely shocked by the news. Master of the Order, Windu, and his 2 brothers from the High Council were killed in a bombing. The Jedi Council gathered before the Senate to defend the clones, not those who killed their brothers, but the ones who served in the war without betraying the Republic. While it was kind of the Jedi to stand up for the overall clone army, the Senate didn't care. Restrictions were going to be put in place to punish the clones. They'd not be hurt or lose their rights, the very little they had, but the clones would not be permitted to interact with the general public. Aside from a very small unit under Commander Fox, the Coruscant Guard would be sent into action on the front lines, and local police would take up the mantle of controlling Coruscant streets. Clones would have enforced curfews and their freedoms would be restricted. This forced the men of the Grand Army of the Republic to become upset. Their brothers of the 21st Nova Corps had betrayed them. However, there was the message that started to slip between clone ranks regarding the attack. The military version of Pass the Telephone did work in the Nova Corps' favor. Clones learned that their brothers did this for a reason. The word of mouth was started by Bacara's lieutenant, who hid his identity as a clone to sneak into the barracks and start telling his brothers before vanishing and doing it elsewhere. The Senate, Jedi Council, and Chancellor were unaware of this word of mouth thing. Their only focus was enforcing new rules against the clones. There were questions of if the clone army could be trusted, but the Jedi leadership restored a semblance of faith in the clones, being that the Jedi did not seek revenge. They didn't try and tarnish the reputation of their men. It was wrong, and they acted out of line, but the rest of the military should not be punished because of the actions of a few. Nova Corps wasn't a few, but they weren't the whole army, was the main point. In Wild Space, the Clone Rebellion started to conjure up targets, picking a variety of Jedi who deserved to be punished, or were perfect stepping stones for their endeavor to pick up steam. However, they did believe that to end this war, they needed to strike at the Separatists too, so sentient, non-droid leaders became targets as well. Something that became super apparent to these clones is that without the restrictions of the Republic, they could act as their own force. But these clones also knew that to headhunt, they needed to be intelligent. Their targets had to slow down the war effort. Their kills on the 3 counselors was intelligent, but it was a simple bomb. Killing off other Jedi who now didn't fully trust the clones would be more difficult, but they would manage. Very quickly, this headhunting unit of clones snuck back into the main galaxy. They used their fleet as their main base of operations, and used active Republic codes to sneak in where they couldn't be found, interchanging their galactic marine armor for whatever other division they were with, sneaking in the ships and bases undetected, because they were clones after all. The Senate's restrictions on the clones punished all of them, instead of functionally going after the clones who did the attack. It was a true show of their ineffectiveness as a governing body. The Chancellor was also very unconcerned with this. He did give Dooku an incentive to find these clones and kill them, but since the Jedi did believe there was foul play in the water, Palpatine himself wasn't too concerned. The following few months would be filled with Jedi deaths and Separatist leader deaths, none of these being Jedi high ranking, aside from Even Peel getting caught in an explosion that targeted Tarkin. The clone headhunters realized early into the 3rd month of their endeavor that simply killing Jedi wasn't doing the job. By this point, the Jedi started to rescind their protection of these clones, not the whole Grand Army, but these rogues specifically. It was much harder to defend the clone army altogether, but it was clear that these assaults were coming from the rogue clone unit, but the point being that the clones stopped attacking the Jedi. The initial point of the rebellion came because of Jedi enslavement of their brothers, but it was clear that that was no longer the issue, or never was, so senators and Republic officers were the target next. These clones also did get a little more scroungy. They were trying to end this thing, and so, if they hurt or killed their own brothers in the pursuit of ending the war, then so be it. They couldn't stop every casualty from ever happening. It was unfortunate, but they had to finish this thing. The men of the rogue unit did get killed, and it started to become more frequent. Their battle tactics weren't always precise or perfect, so hoping that they would simply walk away unscathed wasn't a promise. But the fact is, their attack patterns and strategies were beginning to get countered by other clones, ones who were ordered to kill on sight. Regardless of them being brothers, it was becoming too deadly for too many people. But these rogue clones were also learning more about the movement they were trying to stop. Their initial conception of the idea came from distaste for the Jedi, but they, like the clones, were a cog in the system. Paying attention to the actual politics of the war, they were Republic officers who perpetuated sickening treatment of the clones. The Senate often regarded the clones as lesser beings, and only a means to an end, and Separatist treatment of their brothers was even worse. The uphill battle felt impossible now. That is until these clones came up with another attack strategy. Since the beginning of their movement, some high-profile names had been killed by them. Krell, Trench, Tarkin, Peel, and Martuka the Separatists. But the truth is, they weren't even scratching the surface of ending this war. Their brutality was always looking at the wrong place. Rogue strategists sat around holotables and thought out ways to end this war, and they never could get the right target. They were so focused on the narrow view of the picture. They were always seeing commanders on both sides. These were Jedi and Separatist sentient leaders. Targeting them and killing them was only removing a piece from the board. They were simply a means to an end for both sides. The only difference is, unlike the clones, they were fewer and so therefore considered more important, ranking-wise at least. So this brought the rogues back to their main target, the real warmongers, the true slavers of this operation, of this galactic-scale war. Their target should have always been the Senate. The Senate on both sides sat there without a worry in their hearts, because the clones targeted the wrong people. The senators and representatives were never at risk because the clones showed them that they were never considered to be warmongers. Many of the clones became even more irritated now. They had sacrificed precious time, energy, and resources, and now they would struggle just getting into Coruscant to end this. Well, Omega Squad had an idea. The commanders planned on using the same method to accomplish their goals on Raxus. Ending this war meant ridding the possibility of these senates and killing representatives that were war-focused, so they'd have to forget about the potential of civilian casualties. Their clone programming told them to protect the citizens, but they needed to end this. They couldn't remotely try and end this any other way. The only way this conflict could end with was a joint attack on both governments. Omega Squad laid out a plan, one that would give the clones a true chance to strike at the heart of these governments and rupture their entire war effort. There was a worry for what would come after, but they had to try. Months of planning would go into this, and when they had everything set, this rogue clone unit would move into both Raxus and Coruscant at the same time. They recognized during their planning that it was vital for them to protect the lives of senators who did not support the war and were outwardly against it. This did include Palpatine ironically, because he often spoke about not wanting a war. These rogue clones would strike in the middle of the night, sneaking in as thieves, using their training and their wide variety of munitions to lay down bombs inside Senate seats on both planets, and they would expertly prepare strikes that could destroy the entire war effort for both the Republic and the Separatists. When the morning came and the next level of Republic and Confederacy bickering started, bombs that were laid were deployed and ripped through both entire governmental buildings. The support for Palpatine's pod was hit, but he used the Force to cushion his fall, so he could call it a miracle he survived. Because both sides of government were hit hard by this, they knew that they hadn't made the attack on each other, but it forced many outside of the government to become extremely upset. They saw these attacks as terrifying, but because no one could connect the war back to the rogue clone element, it started to make people wonder if they had gone too far, because it realistically did. It was a galaxy-spanning war, and now guerrillas that weren't affiliated with either government were attacking both? That could and should be cause for concern. How far could they let these extremists go? Killing officers, Jedi, no one really cared about that, but senators was different. The clones that did this were especially happy, because when it showed that there were thieves behind this, it excluded the clone element from the potential of being responsible. So many of the previous deaths on generals and so forth were done while wearing clone armor. This was the first attack not done with their armor on, so they had both elements of that playing against the fact that it could be clones. And they intentionally didn't take credit for it, like they had with previous attacks. Because of this, many reconsidered what the war was actually doing to the galaxy, and so many pro-peace senators on both sides, being most of the only survivors, took the only natural course of action, which were peace talks. This led to the galaxy to begin a ceasefire. As a result, the rogue clones picked their targets and moved in. Because the Zygerians had been disrupted by the Jedi leading up to these events, it gave them a chance to strike a weak empire that had very little friendship with the rest of the Outer Rim. The Hutts or Black Suns wouldn't care if the clones came in and took the power of the Zygerians, being the main point. With so much galactic policy overtaking the tragedy of mass death in the governments, the rogue clones needed to change their scenery and find a new home. On Zygeria, the men of the 21st Nova Corps and their new allies, whoever joined them since they began, moved through the streets. A few sparse skirmishes began, where the clones, elite men, killed off whoever challenged them. A bunch of slavers were certainly not a bunch of clone troopers and soldiers who had an easy time defending themselves. They did try their best, but the Galactic Marines were elite by every means, and they were also eager for an actual battle. So much of their tactical sneaking around was successful, but they, with this assault, were able to do what they wanted to do: kill. These were unhinged clones that had operated in a quadrant of the galaxy with very little people, and they were working day in and day out to end the enslavement of their brothers. The mental burden they put on themselves had done this, and they were hungry for real action. When they got it, they took the capital city in less than 2 hours. It was an overwhelming victory on their part. The next few months would be filled to the brim with political squabbling, as the Sith tried to rectify their little situation. It didn't work in their favor initially, because Palpatine was removed from office by the delegation of 2000, which was made by people that were unaffected by the bombing that rocked both governments. It was clear to most people in the galaxy that this attack was a plea to end the war, because none came after him. Surprisingly, an act of terror actually resulted in getting the galaxy to come to a peace treaty, and with Palpatine's removal from the Republic, another conflict would begin. The Confederacy and Republic met and came to peace. All the present senators from both sides advocated for peace, and with little resistance, it actually came. There were conspiracies about how this was the work of the delegation of 2000, and some systems were ready to believe it, but the peace times would be better for everyone. So could they really be upset if it was the delegation that did this? Which it wasn't, obviously. Because Palpatine no longer had a stake in the Republic, he fled the Dooku and Grievous' side. The rogue element on Zygeria celebrated, until darkness covered the galaxy. The clones, a week before the first battle started, were given their freedom, which meant they can enlist again, or they could go out and start their lives. Many of the clones decided to start their own lives, which meant leaving the Republic vulnerable to a Sith attack, which did come. This very protective build for the clones would weaken the Republic into obsolescence, but because the Sith were outwardly attacking the galaxy, it wasn't like the Clone War, it was a terminate or join type of war. The first system attacked wasn't aware of these conditions, and the entire planet, population, was erased from existence as a show of what the Sith were willing to do. With a chance to respond, the delegation of 2000 Republic-led coalition needed to do something, because General Grievous was propped up as a head of this organization. There'd be no peace treaties with that monster, so the Republic needed to try something else. Full-blown war was the only other option. This came from local militias trying to stop a fully armed droid army. But there was nothing the galaxy could do. Even with flocks of Jedi, clones, and civilians from both sides of the previous war moving to defend themselves, they were overrun. On Zygeria, many of the clones couldn't believe what they had done. Their rogue tactics had made a bad situation even worse, and they blamed themselves. But they could fix this, right? So they very quickly went out of their way to attack Grievous' led military. In their attempt, an entire squad of veteran guerrillas were slaughtered, because what they didn't understand about Tyrannus and Sidious was they were not mere politicians, they were Sith, and Sith would not just be killed by a bunch of lab creations. This did prompt the clones to try and inform the Jedi of where these Sith were, but that might be troublesome. However, the rogues were willing to subscribe to the notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and it turns out the Jedi were their friends this entire time. The correspondence did help, but truthfully, without Mace Windu, because of the rogues, it was very hard to successfully hit the Sith. Elite units of Jedi and clones would make strikes, and they would stop movement, but Tyrannus and Sidious allowed Grievous to be their scapegoat, so they were never ever really around these attacks, which Grievous had a great time with. With the war heating up, and the galaxy suffering under a new scourge of Sith assaults, it became an impossible fight for the Republic. They didn't have the numbers to fight back, and they certainly didn't have a means of finding victory through this. The commando attacks were helping, but they would never be enough, and that was the problem. They couldn't reach the Sith, and now the Jedi knew it was Sith, they couldn't actually get to them. They tried Moribund and other Sith homeworlds, but nothing could be found. Sidious just stayed out of sight, because this would be easy and he didn't need to be involved. At the end of the year, the war reached the core, the final defense for the free galaxy. Palpatine had sights on victory, and an attack led by the Jedi to his position tried to change that. Grandmaster Yoda brought almost his entire council with him, but ironically that wasn't enough. Yoda was enough, but the Sith were working with Grievous, Asajj, and Dooku, because Sidious never ordered Ventress's death. This council, one beaten down by rogue clone attacks, was unable to defend themselves. Every single Jedi of this lightsaber duel would be killed or mortally wounded. Those captured were tortured until their deaths. While the war for the galaxy was becoming futile, the clones decided that instead of trying to fight, they'd create themselves a clone refuge. So Zygeria and her surrounding planets would be captured by the rogue clones and turned into a safe place for those not willing to fight in the war. Slick, Bacara, Alpha, and Neo had come to a conclusion. This war was terrible, but they couldn't stop their brothers from wanting to participate. Something none of them had considered was this. The clones, despite being soldiers and quote-unquote slaves of the Republic, did have a choice. Many of them took their time to find it, but serving the Jedi and fighting the CIS was something they were each fine with, and took with responsibility. They could not force their brothers to choose this path for themselves. Clones like Cut Lawquane had a choice, and they made theirs, just like this rogue element. Having seen what their actions had caused, they stopped interfering and put their heads down. It was probably for the best that they did anyways. With the Outer Rim taking in new clones, the old guard fell, and the Republic collapsed under the weight of a Sith victory. A true Sith victory. Sidious and Tyrannus would proclaim themselves as the new rulers of this empire, and those who stood with it were free, while those who didn't would become oppressed. The two Sith knew what was to come. They were going to establish their new reign, and with it, do away with the rule of two. Asajj becoming Grand Inquisitor, and Grievous finding his place in the New Order, even returning to his home world and being crowned as king. The Sith rise was unpredictable, and with all the senators of the Republic dying, it was up to surviving Jedi to make their return. But that would not come soon. Survivor, Anakin Skywalker, who had lost his entire other arm to Grievous in a duel between he and Obi-Wan, would return. But for the clones and their planets in the Zerian system, they'd have free and fulfilling lives. Like Cut Lawquane, they could choose their own paths, and that's what they did. Slick's rebellion may have completely changed the status quo of the galaxy, but for hundreds of thousands of clones, they would get their freedom instead of dying in a war that meant nothing to them. Their interest in galactic politics would be very minute, and their only enemy would be local pirates or criminal organizations trying to threaten them, none of which ever succeeding. The Sith victory would lead to generations worth of pain, and long after the clones had all naturally passed away, there'd be a chance for change, a chance for hope, as a new Jedi Order established under the Chosen One would bring balance to the Force. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons: General Wells, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D. Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sense Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, 46 Star Wars, Earbus, Rex the Wolf, Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. First morning channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. A lot of what I went for was Saw Gerrera's Rebels, right? You see that in Bad Batch, Clone Wars, Rebels, and Andor, and I wanted to kind of cover that kind of tone here, that extremist tone just being put through clones. It's like a movement starting like 10 years earlier, essentially. And I kind of wanted to show how they would be doing this out of hope to like free their brothers and save them, but it also inadvertently causing more ruptures. How doing this in this such negative way would actually hurt their brothers more. It's kind of twisted, kind of dark. And I think it makes sense to go that way because initially, Slick is like, oh, I want to help my brothers not be enslaved by the Republic. So he blows up half their barracks and is like, yeah, I'm going to send information to the Separatists. Like, no, that doesn't help anybody. You're just trying to get them killed. So that's kind of what I wanted to emphasize on, is how, like, Slick, no matter what he does, is kind of going to hurt his brothers more. Like, more clones definitely survive in this scenario. It's just, it kind of results in them having more burden on them for a little bit longer before they get their freedom. So I hope you all enjoyed. A little bit of a dark story, but I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.